I will honestly say I don't remember ever speaking a word to Esther the whole time she was there. We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
At 78, Jimmie Walker finally confirms the rumors about Esther Rolle. There are stories in Hollywood that never quite die. They circulate in fan communities, resurface in comment sections, and get passed down from one generation of television lovers to the next. Some of these stories are exaggerated. Some are completely fabricated. But every once in a while, one of them turns out to be true. And when the person at the center of that story finally decides to speak, the silence that breaks can be deafening. For nearly 5 decades, one of the most talked about behind-the-scenes relationships in classic American television has been the dynamic between Jimmie Walker and Esther Rolle, the co-stars of the groundbreaking 1970 sitcom Good Times. On screen, they played J.J. Evans and Florida Evans, a son and mother whose bond was central to the warmth and humor of the show. Off-screen, however, the reality was something far more complicated. Fans sensed it. Critics wrote about it. And the internet, for as long as the internet has existed, never stopped debating it. Now, at 78 years old, Jimmie Walker has finally addressed the rumors directly. And what he said is both simpler and more layered than most people expected. To understand what happened between Jimmie Walker and Esther Rolle, you have to first understand what Good Times meant when premiered in February of 1974. Created by Eric Monty and Mike Evans, and developed by legendary producer Norman Lear, the show was unlike almost anything that had appeared on American television before it. It centered on the Evans family, a black working-class household living in a Chicago housing project. It did not shy away from poverty, struggle, or systemic inequality. It told the truth, or at least it tried to. Esther Rolle, who played the matriarch Florida Evans, came to the show with a clear sense of purpose. She was not simply an actress looking for a paycheck. She was a woman with deep convictions about representation, about dignity, and about what it meant to show black family life on a national platform. She had already played Florida Evans on Maude, the Norman Lear production that preceded Good Times, and she carried those values with her when the character got her own show. John Amos, who played the father James Evans, shared that vision entirely. He was a serious actor who believed that storytelling carried real responsibility. Together, Rolle and Amos formed the moral and emotional backbone of the series. They wanted the Evans family to be something that black audiences could look at and feel genuinely seen by. Something real, something dignified. And then there was Jimmie Walker. Jimmie Walker came to Good Times from a world of stand-up comedy. Before the show, he had been performing in clubs around New York City since the late 1960s, sharpening a comedic style that was fast, physical, and impossible to ignore. He had appeared on various television programs and built a following among audiences who loved his energy and sharp timing. When Norman Lear cast him as J.J. Evans, the oldest son of the Evans family, he was already a performer with real instincts and genuine skill. What nobody fully anticipated was how quickly the audience would fall in love with J.J. The character's catchphrase, Dynamite, became one of the most recognizable expressions in American pop culture almost overnight. J.J.'s loud outfits, his exaggerated expressions, his rapid-fire jokes. Audiences simply could not get enough. The ratings reflected this enthusiasm clearly and consistently. The network, as networks tend to do, followed the numbers. Slowly but unmistakably, the show began to shift its focus. Episodes that might have once explored the financial pressures facing the Evans family or the social realities of life in Cabrini Green began to make more room for J.J.'s antics. The comedy grew broader. The punchlines came faster. And the serious, grounded storytelling that Rolle and Amos had fought to establish began losing ground. This is the moment where the tension began, not in any single argument or dramatic confrontation, but in a gradual, creeping awareness that the show was becoming something different from what some of its cast members had signed up to be part of. The laughter continued on screen, but behind the cameras, something was quietly fracturing. Over the years, countless articles and television segments described the relationship between Esther Rolle and Jimmie Walker as a feud. The word gets used casually, as though the two were simply rivals who could not stand each other personally. But that framing has always been misleading, and it does a real disservice to what Rolle was actually expressing. In interviews she gave during and after her time on the show, Rolle was articulate and specific about her concerns. She was not attacking Jimmie Walker the person. She was criticizing what the character JJ had been allowed to become. She spoke about how JJ had evolved into a figure who did not work, did not read, and seemed to operate without any real sense of responsibility or direction. She felt that this portrayal sent harmful messages to audiences, and that it undermined the very purpose the show had been created to serve. Her frustration was directed at the writers, the producers, and the network. It was a frustration rooted in principle, not in personal animosity. Rolle understood the difference between an actor doing his job and a system shaping the story in ways she found deeply troubling. She was sophisticated enough to make that distinction clearly, even if the press consistently chose not to. John Amos expressed similar sentiments throughout his time on the show. He felt that the creative team did not always understand or respect the community the show was supposed to represent. He pushed back on storylines and dialogue that he believed missed the mark entirely, and ultimately, that resistance cost him his place on the series. By the end of the third season, James Evans had been written off the show. His character was killed off in a car accident, and one of the most compelling father figures in the history of American sitcoms was simply gone. The loss was felt immediately by audiences, and even more deeply by those who remained on set. Something essential had been removed, and everyone could feel the absence. None of this, however, fully explains the personal distance between Rolle and Walker, because even accounting for creative disagreements and ideological differences, there remains the simple human question of why two people who spent years working together side by side never developed even a basic friendship. Jimmie Walker has now answered that question in his own words. In a candid conversation about his time on Good Times, Walker described the relationship plainly and without hesitation. He said that he and Esther Rolle were never friends, that they never spent time together outside of work, that they never had each other's contact information, that their relationship existed entirely within the boundaries of the set and nowhere else outside of it. This is a striking admission when you sit with it for a moment. These were two people who played mother and son on national television for years. Their characters embraced, argued, laughed, and grieved together. Audiences watched them and believed completely in their bond. And yet, in real life, they were essentially strangers to one another. Walker has been careful not to frame this as hostility. He has not described Rolle as someone who treated him poorly or went out of her way to make his life difficult. What is described is something perhaps more quietly sad. Two people who were simply never able to bridge the gap between their different worlds, different approaches, and different ideas about what they were doing and why. That kind of distance does not require anger to be real. Sometimes silence alone is enough to keep two people permanently apart. Norman Lear, who knew both of them well and watched the entire situation unfold from a position of responsibility, has reflected on this dynamic over the years. He acknowledged that the tension on set was genuine and that he wished things had unfolded differently. He expressed the belief that the coldness Rolle and Amos showed toward Walker during those early years contributed to him withdrawing further into himself, becoming more isolated and more dependent on persona of JJ rather than finding common ground with his cast members as real people. Whether that observation is entirely fair is something people can debate, but it does add another layer to a situation that was never as simple as any single headline made it seem. What emerges from all of these accounts, taken together, is a picture that is far more nuanced than the word feud can contain. This was not two celebrities fighting over billing or salary or personal slights. This was a genuine philosophical divide about the purpose of art and the weight of representation. Esther Rolle and John Amos believed they were doing something that mattered beyond entertainment. They were aware, in a way that few television performers of that era were willing to say publicly, that the images projected on screen carried real cultural weight. They knew that millions of Black Americans would watch this show and see reflections of themselves, and they took that awareness seriously. When they felt the show was drifting away from dignity and toward caricature, they did not stay silent. They pushed back, they spoke out, and eventually they walked away. Jimmie Walker was in a fundamentally different position. He was a comedian by nature and by training. He had been hired to make people laugh, and he was extraordinarily good at it. He was not in a position to control how his character was written or how the producers chose to use him. He was doing what the job required. He showed up, he delivered, and he trusted the people around him to manage the larger questions. Not everyone on the Good Times set experienced those years as a battle. Bernadette Stanis, who played Delma Evans, has spoken warmly about her time on the show across numerous interviews and public conversations over the decades. She remembers the laughter between scenes, the genuine camaraderie that developed among the younger cast members, and the moments when even the underlying tension would ease and everyone simply enjoyed being part of something together. Stanis has been consistent in pushing back against the idea that the set was entirely consumed by conflict. She has acknowledged that creative differences were real, and that Rolle and Amos felt strongly and deeply about the direction of the show. But she has also made clear that these differences did not poison the overall atmosphere. There were real friendships formed during those years. There was genuine joy in the work, and the cast, whatever their private disagreements, managed to come together in front of the cameras and create something that tens of millions of people across America genuinely loved. Ralph Carter, who played the youngest Evans child, Michael, has offered similar reflections across the years. He has described watching Rolle and Amos navigate their frustrations with a quiet kind of dignity, never turning their grievances into weapons aimed at the other people they work with every day. He remembers a set that could be serious and heavy with unspoken tension, but also one that could erupt into completely genuine laughter at the most unexpected moments. What these testimonies suggest, taken together, is that the story of Good Times behind the scenes was never simply a story of conflict. It was a story of human beings with different backgrounds, different values, and different visions trying to do their best work under genuinely complicated conditions. Some of them succeeded in connecting with each other as people. Some of them did not. And the full picture requires holding all of that complexity at once rather than flattening it into something easier to summarize. At 78, Jimmie Walker has lived long enough to look back on all of it with a perspective that takes years to earn. He has been performing for more than 5 decades. He has watched Good Times travel from a current hit to a classic, from a classic to a cultural touchstone that entirely new generations are still discovering and debating today. And through all of it, he has maintained a directness about his own experience that is, in its own quiet way, something worth respecting. He does not claim that everything was perfect. He does not pretend that the relationships on set were warmer than they actually were. He tells the truth as he lived it, without embellishment and without bitterness. His confirmation of the distance between himself and Esther Rolle is not a condemnation of her character or her legacy. He has never tried to diminish what she stood for or what she accomplished. She was, by any honest measure, one of the most significant and important figures in the history of American television. Her insistence on dignity and authenticity helped establish a standard that still resonates through every serious production that has tried to tell honest stories about Black life in America in the decade since. Good Times ran for 6 seasons, from 1974 to 1979, producing 133 episodes that continue to be watched, studied, and discussed more than 4 decades after the final credits rolled. The show launched careers, sparked genuine cultural debates, and opened doors in American television that had previously been firmly closed. It was imperfect, contested, and sometimes deeply contradictory. It was, in other words, exactly what most things of real cultural importance tend to be. Its legacy does not live in any single storyline or performance. It lives in the conversations it started, in the questions it raised about who gets to tell stories and whose dignity gets protected in the telling, in the laughter it generated and the tears it drew and the arguments it provoked among people who cared deeply about what television was capable of doing and being. There is something both sobering and clarifying about hearing Jimmie Walker speak honestly about those years at this point in his life. He is not trying to rewrite history. He is not seeking sympathy or using his platform to settle old scores. He is simply telling the truth about an experience that shaped him in ways he is still able to articulate with clarity and calm. The rumors were not entirely wrong. The distance was real. The creative tension was genuine and deep-rooted. But the full story, as it almost always turns out to be, is richer and more human than any rumor could fully capture. It is a story of artists with genuinely different visions trying to share the same stage, of a network responding to ratings at the expense of something far harder to measure, of people who never quite found a way to truly understand each other, even while creating something together that neither of them could have made alone. At 78, Jimmie Walker has earned every right to tell that story on his own terms. And now that he finally has, the most honest response is not shock or judgment, but simply a deeper appreciation for the full truth of something that mattered then and still matters now.